morning, everybody, and happy Friday. Apparently only the strong survive this early in the morning. I'm going to take you into a very new concept today. I call it the biological hologram, which is how we need to start thinking about the body as a systems biological approach with all the interrelationships and what we call diseases. And as from a cardiovascular point of view, what I've learned is if I don't understand the other disciplines well, I simply cannot practice good cardiovascular medicine. And I think whatever your discipline is, you're going to determine eventually that you also have to understand all this as well. So let's go with the first concept, which is there are no diseases. We've got to redefine. There's processes, and they're very similar. Our goal is not to really start doing more ICD-9 and ICD-10 codes, but to start determining the reason that patients have what we define as a disease. So prevention and treatment strategies are very important as we go forward in looking at what we have called diseases in the past. These are the three things that are underlying every disease or process that occurs in the human body. And if you understand inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction, we're going to learn to backtrack and turn the system upside down. Look at these finite responses, which are coming from infinite numbers of insults, resulting in a process that we name a disease so we can get paid for it with an ICD-9 code. So this is what you're going to learn today. We're going to take each system and plug it into the infinite insult results in three finite responses. So this is the summary of everything I'm going to tell you today, and then we'll get into the specifics. So there's an infinite number of internal as well as external insults that produce injury to your cells. That initial and acute defensive response that the cell has is to protect itself from the damage and try to contain the insult. That is appropriate and it's correct. However, if you continue to insult yourself with whatever it is, your environmental insults or food, toxins or whatever, the cell or the organ is going to continue to be damaged. And often it's as an innocent bystander. So the processes that are inherent are very similar in every cell and every organ, and they lead to very specific and recognizable patterns that we call a disease, and it depends on the organ in which it's involved in. So cardiovascular disease, neurological, gastrointestinal, even cancer, all have interrelationships that are very similar based on these three finite responses. So this is what you have coming in every day into your system, a virtual tsunami. And this is what will happen if we don't start removing the insults coming in, but also determine how to treat the responses. So as we start looking at things, we can plug in very simplistic concepts that relate to how does the body respond to what's coming in. And the first line of defense is the membrane. So let's take just a couple of minutes and define membrane function and dysfunction. This is your protective barrier between the external and the internal environment. So no matter how you define it, a membrane is a membrane. It's got the same constituents, fatty acids, proteins, receptors. So if it's your blood vessel, it's your endothelial lining. That's endothelial dysfunction. It's your brain, the blood-brain barrier, brain dysfunction. Enterocyte dysfunction. You could go on and on. The point is, if you learn the pathophysiology of membrane dysfunction, and I always tell people, if you understand vascular biology, you can put this into the system and understand all of it. You can then take the same principles and apply them to all the different diseases. So there's your classic membrane, bilayer, and on the outside are different receptors, and those receptors are going to determine what the insults do to direct signaling from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. And we have all these different receptors, pattern recognition receptors, toll-like receptors, calveoli, they all have very fancy names. The point is, they all have a purpose. And their purpose, interestingly, is to create the three finite responses: inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction, or to tone it down. So it's either a protective mechanism or a defensive mechanism, but if it goes on, it becomes a disease and a process that is damaging to the cell. One of the things that is in the membrane are called calveoli, and in those calveoli is a very important substance, nitric oxide, which determines particularly vascular health, but it also determines neurological health, gut health, and even cancer relations. Those calveoli are lipid microdomains, and they respond to dietary intake and toxins. And what happens if you damage those membranes, those calveoli, the nitric oxide levels will drop. And you can see what will happen systemically if NO levels are low. Dietary intake, polyphenols, omega-3 fatty acids, a whole list of nutrients that will turn on or turn off calveolar function and thus nitric oxide levels. So the idea is to begin to think, how can we reduce the insults to the membrane first to turn off the downstream signaling that causes the three finite responses within the cell? I'll give you just one example. There are many. Omega-3 fatty acids, particularly DHA. Giving DHA and EFA and other essential fatty acids has been shown to stabilize cell membranes, improve calveolar function, increase nitric oxide release, downstream signaling mechanisms that are generally beneficial, and they turn off the three finite responses in an appropriate way, but they allow the body to still defend itself when it's necessary. These are through toll-like receptors as well as other pattern recognition receptors. These are some of the plant-derived polyphenols and other things that can modulate membrane function. Fruits and vegetables, resveratrol, quercetin, one of my favorites, red wine, green tea extract, dark chocolate, and other flavonoids. All of these will turn off inflammatory, immune, and oxidative stress responses. So now what I want to do is take each of these different diseases as we've defined them and look at how it interrelates to other diseases. So let's first look at cardiovascular and cardiorenal. So we know that cardiovascular includes coronary heart disease, hypertension, dyslipidemia, diabetes, and heart failure and stroke, the number one cause of death in the United States and worldwide. And if you look at the membrane dysfunction in this system, it's the the endothelial cell. So the endothelial dysfunction is going to determine what happens within the blood, but also within the vascular smooth muscle. So the endothelial lining, just like the enterocyte, or just like the blood-brain barrier, has the same reactions to what's circulating in the blood. So if you understand this system, the vascular biology, you can now apply it to the others. This is a very simple diagram of what the endothelial lining looks like. So the green is the endothelium, and on top of that are receptors in white. Now, we can pick one receptor here to talk about, which is really the antithesis and the balance that occurs in the vascular system. So coming in on the outside is called an angiotensin 1 receptor, AT1. So angiotensin 2 stimulates that receptor and sets off an inflammatory oxidative stress process that then counterbalances the production of nitric oxide, which is coming from arginine and nitrites and nitrates in your diet. So the first step that you see in the vascular biology story is where the two come together. So superoxide anion, which is an oxidative stress mediator, takes out nitric oxide bioavailability, which means that high inflammation and high oxidative stress automatically turns off NO production and bioavailability, and you're going to get disease related to that. So there's two ways to approach it. One, let's increase nitric oxide bioavailability, or two, let's turn off the things that destroy nitric oxide, reduce the oxidative stress, the inflammation, and the immune dysfunction. So this is the pattern of toll-like receptors, pattern recognition receptors that really apply to every cell membrane. But I've done here for you is the vascular system. So up at the top, infinite numbers of insults, and we can divide these into two major groups. One is the biomechanical blood pressure, changes in blood flow and oscillation. And on the other side is all the other factors, the biochemical. So this would be hormones, toxins, normal cell breakdown, nutritional problems, non-sterile antigens. These are converted into neoantigens, and they also have the ability to directly stimulate those receptors. And so on the top you'll see pattern recognition receptors, toll-like receptors, nods, and calveoli stimulated by the external insults, and these then are transmitted internally through different signaling mechanisms to turn on 3 finite responses. So microbes, sterile antigens, micronutrients, all these come in, attach to those receptors, create the 3 finite responses, which are appropriate in the acute setting to defend the cell from damage, but continued insults result in continued damage. And now, whatever that organ happens to be becomes an innocent bystander in a defense process that is now an offensive process. Vascular, gut, brain, oncogenes. So the blood vessel then is an innocent bystander in development of coronary heart disease and congestive heart failure. And we have to back up in time and realize this is a preclinical problem. And if we can identify this disease early, before the patient has clinical symptoms through non-invasive vascular testing or biomarkers, we can prevent cardiovascular disease. We also know that cardiac disease, vascular disease, is an autoimmune process. The blood vessel and all the damage that occurs is related to T cells and B cells that are turned on without proper regulation of regulatory T cells. So in essence, vascular disease, coronary heart disease, myocardial infarction is an autoimmune process. The kidney, same process. You've got now a different membrane. It's the glomerular basement membrane. It's the same story. Damage, you can imagine the things that are getting filtered through the kidney, the potential for damage occurring in the glomerular basement membrane. So we have the epithelial cells, the podocytes, and then we have the subendothelial cells, which is basically your vascular endothelium. So now we've got 2 systems trying to protect damage to the kidney, but it's the same process that I just described. So we start looking at these interconnections between the vascular system and the other systems, xenobiotics, hormetic responses, toxins that are coming in, and signal responses, and try to think of the system, again, as a systems biological hologram. Now, the brain and the heart and the gut and other systems are also interrelated, but let's look first at what I call cardiovascular neuroimmunology. We can tack as many words as we want to here and come out with a sentence of diseases that are interrelated. The basic concept is whatever you think happens instantaneously within every part of your body. So in the cardiovascular system, if you think it, sympathetic system, vagal system, parasympathetic overtone, those immediately turn on or turn off inflammatory cells or autoimmune cells. In other words, if you have a sympathetic or angiotensin II mediated something in your brain, it will send a signal directly through an efferent nerve, vagal or sympathetic, that attaches to a T cell or some other cell that turns on immune dysfunction. So systemic inflammation goes backward and causes brain inflammation, and brain inflammation goes forward, could cause vascular and systemic inflammation. And it's like that, instantaneously. And it's mediated through the nervous system. So neuroregulation of cardiovascular function is very important. All the things I just told you that happen in the vascular system are going on in the brain. It's the same receptors. It's the same system. It's the same molecules. So toll-like receptors, angiotensin II, all these things are mediated in the brain that determine cardiovascular function, and also bidirectional through the other way. So for example, angiotensin II works in the brain to turn on inflammation, just like angiotensin II works in the systemic circuit to turn on vascular dysfunction and cause hypertension and atherosclerosis. This is a nice schematic of how this actually works. So your brain is firing off afferent nervous stimuli that go into the spleen. They also go directly to T cells and to macrophages, create a system that goes into the nucleus of the cell, turns on NF-kappa beta, and then spits out all these inflammatory cytokines, which then back directional to the brain to say, we need to turn you on or turn you off. So there's a very tight control system. But the point is, this is mediated through direct stimulation of nerves, but also through the immune system and through inflammatory mediators. So there's this process that goes on. Feed forward means that you start getting problems and they get more and more aggressive as time goes on, unless you can cut them off through some sort of process or treatment, whether it's a drug or a nutrient or a lifestyle change. Angiotensin II then activates T cells, activates macrophages and dendritic cells both in the brain and the peripheral arteries. So that central nervous system inflammation and oxidative stress are very similar then to vascular. So this is kind of a summary of what I just told you related to vasco-neuroimmunology. So angiotensin II stimulates brainstem nuclei. You've got radical oxygen species and aldosterone, all feeding into different receptors. Angiotensin II receptor, the CNS mineralocorticoid receptors, these activate T cells. The T cells then produce interleukins, 17, 10, TNF-alpha, TGF-beta, and you get an inflammatory immune response resulting in hypertension, endothelial dysfunction, and vascular disease. Now let's talk about how the GI tract interrelates with the cardiovascular system. So imagine a leaky gut, no system control, everything's flowing in, the bacteria, the bad food, and if I'm a cardiovascular specialist and I'm saying, how am I going to control the insults, I better know how to treat gastrointestinal disease in the gut, otherwise I'll never get control over it. I've got to stop the sieve. So unfortunately or fortunately, ever how you look at it, if you're cardiovascular, you're going to have to be a gastroenterologist. So atherosclerosis is a postprandial disease. Every time you eat, you get endothelial dysfunction. In fact, every time you eat, you get metabolic endotoxemia. It's low-grade sepsis because you have dead bacteria, live bacteria, micronutrients that are inflammatory going into your gut. The smaller the holes, the less problem. But everybody has it, and it's more severe in some patients than others who have gut disease. There are certain things you can do to clean up your gut. We won't do that today, but you know what those things are. Pathogens, the microbiota, you all are aware now of the incredible role of the microbiome in determining your health. And we have more microbes floating around than we have genes, so we have to be sure they're happy. So chronic infections, for example, of any type, lipopolysaccharides, which is the cell wall of bacteria, go in through these holes in the inner site, and then they go into the bloodstream, and they create immune dysfunction, inflammation, and oxidative stress. So we've got to address not just the GI health, but also what are the insults coming in that damage the enterocyte. Most of the underlying problems that we have related to vascular dysfunction and dyslipidemia are related to the three finite responses, but if you look below that, what is it that sets off, for example, a dyslipidemic response? Chronic infections, chronic inflammatory micro and macronutrient intake, and toxins. In fact, about 70 to 80% of the causes of dyslipidemia are one of those three problems. And how do we approach dyslipidemia in traditional medicine? Oh, your lipids are high, let's give you a statin. Let's not ask the question, why do you have dyslipidemia? And let's remove the insult, and guess what will happen? Your dyslipidemia is likely to go away without treatment. So look at the insults for vascular disease and dyslipidemia and remove them first. Now I can put up a diagram here of your blood-brain barrier, your enterocyte or your endothelium, and it will be exactly the same. Everything coming in, the holes, the gap junctions, the receptors, the downstream mediators, the inflammation, the oxidative stress, this diagram covers it. This happens to be the enterocyte. But if you know the model here, the same is true for the other membranes. Your gut has a signal. Vegetarians are different from Paleolithic meat eaters. And the microbiome is going to determine what happens as part of these three finite responses. So you have to be sure that the food intake, the micronutrient intake, and the gut health with prebiotics and probiotics is appropriate to try to tune down some of the finite responses. So that metabolic endotoxemia, which is what's going to set off vascular disease, is reduced by enhancing gut health, closing gap junctions, improving mucosal membrane barriers, and improving the cell signaling transduction that the enterocyte has into the other systems. If you change the microbiota, then more gram-negative bacteria are likely to get into the system. So it becomes a matter of how much you can eliminate to reduce the insult. And what we know, for example, is if you eat a lot of saturated fats, you'll increase the gut content of gram-negative bacteria. So that, in effect, can increase metabolic endotoxemia in coronary heart disease. Now, that may have nothing to do with our old concepts of saturated fats and lipids. It's a totally different mechanism, but it explains to you why trans fats, for example, or saturated fats may have mechanisms that are detrimental to the cardiovascular system that have nothing to do, perhaps, with lipids. The microbiome, we now know that there are certain species that relate directly to coronary heart disease. At autopsy, you can find certain bacteria, live, dead, or their DNA or RNA in the plaque of a coronary artery. So if you have a high risk of coronary heart disease, it's a different microbiotic signature as opposed to a low incidence. So there's different species that we're beginning to understand that relate to coronary heart disease. That we're very new in this. This is changing every day. But I've listed some of the most common species we're looking at right now that relate to coronary heart disease. The diversity of the microbiome is important in determining risk for everything. But related to coronary heart disease, if you have the wrong bacteria, and you probably have read about one of the products that bacteria makes, which is TAMO, trimethylamine oxidase. And that's particularly high in people who eat a lot of meat, but also fish. So there's this controversy going on about the microbiome can relate to atherosclerosis depending on what you feed them. So that's another thing that we're looking at related to constituents in the gut and related to TMO, carnitine, phosphatidylcholine, and the outcomes with atherosclerosis. We know that a high-fat diet, saturated fats, and high trans fats change signal transduction in the membrane, but also change the microbiome. We know that omega-3 fatty acids and monounsaturated fats have the opposite effect to protect the membrane, but also change the microbiome. So balancing all those is very important in reducing cardiovascular disease. This is a very simple diagram of how the gut would relate to these different gut microbiomes. So the gram-negative bacteria, the lipopolysaccharides, come into the enterocyte, down in through the membrane, and then you've got all the bad things on one side, you're obese, high-fat diet, diabetes, hyperglycemia, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, balanced by prebiotics, probiotics, and antibiotic treatment perhaps. And that changes what goes on below, which is inflammation in your adipose tissue, inflammation in the liver, or in the arterial system. So all these different organisms, their cell membranes, the different types of fats, proteins, and other micronutrients that are coming in through the enterocyte are going to have an effect directly on the enterocyte and then indirectly through transport systems through LDL and HDL that then cause damage elsewhere. Remember that lipoproteins are your first defense for chronic infections. They're your first defense for toxins like heavy metals, and they're your first defense for bad diet. So if your lipoproteins are defending you, they take all this up, and then those LDL particles and HDL particles are transported everywhere with whatever's inside them. So if you don't have an appropriate apolipoprotein response to the incoming insults, you can imagine the kind of disarray you're going to have throughout your system. And these then set off all these different receptors, toll-like receptors and nodes throughout the body, then set off the downstream signaling and our three finite responses. So this shows you again in a very nice diagram all these different things that are coming in through the enterocyte, the LPS, the cell wall, the micronutrients attaching to receptors, receptors are stimulated, that goes into the cell nucleus, NF-kappa B, makes cytokines, which then go out into the systemic circuit. We know there's a direct connection between what we eat and what happens in all systems, but particularly in the vascular system and the gut. For example, let's talk about broccoli or cabbage. And this is converted eventually to DIM, which activates a specific receptor that makes the enterocyte healthy. So this is how it looks. You eat some broccoli. It's converted through an oxidative process, condenses, forms DIM, and those then stimulate the AHR receptors, which are like soldiers that go in and repair the enterocyte, close the gaps, improve lymphoid structure, and the mucus lining. So it's very clear that food, micronutrients, and supplements have a huge role in attacking the first part of the system, which is reducing the insults at the gut lining. The other thing that happens is when you eat bad food, your body remembers it. And the next time you do it, it will have metabolic memory, and it will have an exacerbated response that it's worse than the first time. You've all seen this with people, for example, that maybe went gluten-free for 6 or 8 months, and then they sniffed a little gluten in a restaurant one night and had a huge reaction. That's metabolic memory. So we can blunt some of the metabolic memory by putting good foods with bad foods. For example, we know that gamma-tocopherol can blunt some of the postprandial hyperglycemia that you get when you drink a soda. We know that different types of plant phenols can block the receptors that are inflammatory. So I tell people, if you're going to go out and have a McDonald's, some French fries, and a Big Mac, have a piece of steamed broccoli at the same time. So here's the microbe hypothesis. We have the LPS, which attaches to the oxidized LDL because it's been damaged. It's taken up by your macrophages, your enterocytes. Then these go to the subendothelial lining, stimulate the NF-kappa B, stimulate different receptors, stimulate things in your brain. In other words, now we not only have the microbes in the gut and the cardiovascular system, at the same time, that system, that microbial LPS oxidized LDL, through the nervous system stimulates something called psilocin beta, which is in your central nervous system. Now this is a really cool connection. We just described it. Psilocin beta is in your posterior pituitary gland. And when you turn that little rascal on, it causes atherosclerosis by changing all the different steps in the cholesterol pathway. Enzymes, scavenger uptake. So now we have a brain dyslipidemic response mediated through your diet that's totally separate from what happened in the old days, which is, it's all just about what goes into your gut. It's also what goes into your brain. We know that giving probiotics can not only improve lipids, but also blood pressure and reduce coronary heart disease. This is a new field, and it's going to take a while to figure all this out, but the systemic circuit and the trials coming out are very convincing. This is one study where they used L-reuteri and looked at lipids, and they were improved. We've got other studies looking at congestive heart failure and others looking at hypertension. So watch the story for probiotics and CVD. Cardiovascular disease and toxins. This one is very familiar to all of you. Basically, toxins are mitochondrial toxins. They kill your mitochondria, and therefore you end up with oxidative stress and the other finite responses. Endothelial dysfunction, dyslipidemia, coronary heart disease, cancer. So everything that you can think of in your textbook of medicine can happen with toxins. Not only heavy metals, but everything we're breathing in the air. Environmental pollution has been shown to be a major risk for coronary heart disease and stroke. If you live in Shanghai, China, or Beijing, the incidence of lung cancer and coronary heart disease is going through the roof because of the pollution index. So total cardiovascular disease is now clearly related to toxins everywhere, but it's particularly in the air we breathe, which we have ignored as a real problem related to CVD in the past. And unfortunately, the definition of toxins is misplaced because most of the companies that make those things don't even put in them what is in them, so we don't even know what's causing the problem, so it's hard to defend against it. Pesticides, you know, we just heard about Roundup recently and how good it was for you. So it's a story that's scary because of what we're exposed to every day. Now, I'm not an oncologist, but what I've found is my cardiovascular patients have a higher risk of cancer. I'm going, what's that all about? How did that connection occur? Well, it turns out there's this very interesting gene called 9p21. And if you have that gene, your risk for heart attack is increased dramatically. So if you're a heterozygote, it's about 50%. If you're homozygote, it's about 100% risk. It turns out that same gene is related to cancer. So how does that gene turn on both diseases? What's the connection? It's inflammation. That's the connection. 9p21 is associated with over 30 inflammatory genes that turn on CHD and turn on oncogenes in cancer. And there's a very specific one that I've listed here for you. It's called MTAP, and it's related to the polyamine pathway, salvaging adenine and methionine. And it's often deficient in cancer patients, and it's related to the 9p21 genetics. So let's summarize what we've said. David Perlmutter is going to be here either today or tomorrow, and he was nice enough to allow me to take his little fireman that he had for the brain, and I said, you know, David, I think we can make that work for every disease in every organ. So that's what I've done. So this is a cardiovascular disease fireman. So what we're going to do is start over on the left-hand side, and we're going to show you how the disease is the same process in every single thing I'm going to show you. So over to the left with cardiovascular, we start with pattern recognition receptors, toll-like receptors, inflammatory receptors, oxidative stress receptors. Those lead then to the three downstream responses that we've talked about. And then there's the medications, pharmacologic therapy, particularly angiotensin receptor blockers, ACE inhibitors, block that angiotensin 2 receptor. So what you're trying to do is increase nitric oxide bioavailability and block the oxidative response. So that nitric oxide path, what you want to do there is give foods that are high in nitrites and nitrates. So beetroot, dark green leafy vegetables will do that. And then also arginine will feed into the NO pathway. And on the other side is to build up your oxidative defense mechanisms. And there's tons of ways to do that. Yeah. Yes, sir? Okay, I got the first one, which is arginine and citrulline. What's their role? Arginine and citrulline are very important in the eNOS enzyme to make nitric oxide under the age of 40, and after age 40 it becomes less important. And your primary way to make nitric oxide after age 40 is dietary through nitrites, which are converted from nitrates in different types of foods, which is dark green leafy vegetables. Now, one thing I will say is very important, I'm glad you asked this. We do two things in our life right now that are increasing coronary heart disease risk that you would never think have anything to do with it, and it's related to that concept of nitrates and nitrites. How many of you use mouthwash? How many of you are taking a PPI or H2 blocker or have a patient doing so? All right. So if you use mouthwash, it destroys the microbiome in your mouth, so you can't convert nitrates to nitrites. And then the nitrates that do get down to the GI tract into your stomach, if you don't have any hydrochloric acid, you can't convert it. So you then lose about 50 to 60% of the pathway for nitric oxide by using PPIs, H2 blockers, and mouthwash. And the risk for coronary heart disease is going to go very high related to that because NO drops. And you had another question that I didn't catch. The nitrogen? Oh, hydrogen in the what pathway? Free radical pathway. Okay, so the first step is superoxide production, and then that's converted into peroxides and hydroxyl anions. So it's a downstream effect. So if you can block it at the beginning before it takes out NO and gets converted to the downstream, like peroxynitrite and others, you can reduce the oxidative stress. Okay, so he's just describing sort of the process of how oxidative stress occurs in the different radicals, which we and I can have a discussion about that if you want to. Anybody else, real quickly, have maybe 30 seconds left? Dental health, yes. Well, periodontal disease and dental health are an incredible risk factor for coronary heart disease, the microbiome, the endotoxemia. So if you don't address periodontal disease with getting adequate cleanings, cleaning up the bacteria in your mouth, antibiotics perhaps, whatever you have to do, but that's one of the most overlooked causes of coronary heart disease worldwide, particularly in the United States. Thank you for asking that. Thank you very much. Y'all have a great day.